Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Radical Candor podcast. I'm Kim Scott, co-founder of Radical Candor and author of Radical Candor and Just Work.
And I'm Jason Rosoff, CEO and co-founder of Radical Candor.
And I'm Amy Sandler, your host for the Radical Candor podcast. You know, we often get questions from folks who want us to talk through specific radical candor scenarios, like how do you overcome feedback hesitation? Or what do you do when somebody tells you not to bother giving feedback to someone because that person will never change? So on today's episode, we're going to address how to respond to some of these scenarios with radically candid feedback that's kind and clear, specific and sincere, because no problem ever gets solved by being ignored. Kim, do you think that's accurate? Does no problem ever get solved by being ignored?
You know, one of the things that I'm working on is being less absolutist. So there may be some problem, but I was trying to think of one, as you said, and I can't think of one, but I'm sure there is. Maybe somebody can.
I have an example. I don't know if it's a problem, but I've noticed sometimes if I get an email and there's sort of a question floating around, sometimes with the passage of like a day, someone else will actually solve that. But that, I don't know if that's a problem being solved or just a matter of time.
That's delegating to someone else.
I do think if we narrowed the statement slightly, it would be pretty close to always true, which is no problem in a relationship gets solved by ignoring it.
Although little things sometimes just don't matter. Like,
but I would say those aren't actually a problem.
Yeah, that's true. Okay. But sometimes we think things are a problem, but they're not actually. Anyway.
And in the fullness of time, we realize that they're not actually a problem.
In the fullness of time.
Or sometimes in the fullness of time, we realize if only I had said that 5 years ago, this relationship would be in a better place.
Kim, of that story you shared of the guy that got married to the woman who ate with a lot of clanking of a spoon against her teeth, and it all came out years later.
Yeah. He wanted to ignore the problem because he didn't want to be a nitpicking husband. And then 5 years later, he was like, she clanked her spoon on her teeth one last time. He's like, I need a divorce. Obviously, there was probably something else going on. I hope that wasn't the only thing. But sometimes the right thing to do is to wrestle with your own kind of irritation, even maybe an irrational irritation. Other times, it may be more practical to say, I know this is irrational of me, but I can't get over it. Could you help?
Can we buy rubber spoons?
Yes. Could you please not do this? I know it's not a big deal, but it has become a big deal to me.
Yeah. Well, if I may quote Albert Einstein, apparently insanity is doing the same thing over and over and expecting different results. So,
you know, I heard that is not a true quote. And there's also a little bit of a purple flag warning there.
Brandy, we're really having a time on this intro.
But it's good. It's good. But what this quote, which actually isn't from Einstein, is saying is that it's not rational to do the same thing over and over.
There we go.
But being irrational is not being insane. It's being irrational.
Who is it from? It's attributed to Einstein constantly.
I know it is all the time. I forgot whom.
I think it was Jason Rosoff who once said that irrationality is doing the same thing over and over and expecting different results. Was that not you, Jason?
I will not take credit for that. But I do like the idea of naming it what it really is, which is irrationality. So I will keep that in my back pocket.
Yeah, well, I think if we're going to keep this little introduction, I think we've already learned a lot. But this, in fact, was not the point of this episode, which is to actually get into changing our behavior to get different results. So it is hard. It is hard to change our behavior, and we all have our own tendencies that may not always be as rational as we would like. We're human, so we're going to talk through it. Kim, Jason, are we ready to have this conversation?
Yeah,
we're open the box.
Scenarios are inside.
Open the box. All right. Well, we're opening a fictional box with a fictional scenario, but a lot of folks I think can relate to. All right. It is today's strategy meeting for Ocean Motion cruise ships. And we've got BB. BB is a hospitality development manager, and BB is presenting a proposal for a new restaurant. This restaurant is called Turf and Chips. And this is for consideration on the company's flagship vessel. BB's presentation is first on the agenda. After the presentation, BB receives some questions from the leaders in the room. The leaders determine BB and her team, go ahead, continue iterating on that proposal, come back in 2 weeks and provide us with an update. As the meeting concludes, Jack, a senior leader, approaches Kalinda, another senior leader who also happens to be BB's manager, and Jack shares his opinion with Kalinda. Jason, please play the role of Jack.
Kim. If you want someone to speak to me. I'm Kalinda now.
Thank you, Kalinda. Listen, Kalinda, Turf and Chips is definitely not something we would consider for Ocean Motion's flagship vessel. I think we all know that. It just doesn't fit from a thematic perspective. And even though I'm sure BB and the rest of the team have done great work, the numbers for another steak and fries eatery just don't seem compelling enough for us to take the risk on at this point. Pretty sure no matter what the next iteration shows, it's going to get rejected. I just feel bad that the leadership team just told BB to go back and continue working on it. And I think it's going to be really hard for you to tell her this as her manager, since this is our first presentation to our team.
Good job, Jason.
First of all, Jason, you have missed your calling as Jack. Stunning rendition. Kim, can you now play the role of Kim again?
Yes. I'm going to give some feedback to Jack, not to Jason as Jack, because he did a great job. So I think that Jack did some things well and some things badly there. The things that he did well is that he acknowledged that he cared. He sort of said, look, I know she's doing great work. And he said he didn't want to hurt BB's feelings. And at the same time, he was willing to challenge. He's challenging a little indirectly. So if he had said this in the meeting instead of the meeting after the meeting, I would give Jack a better grade. But anyway, he did say that BB is going to waste time doing extra work because he already knows what the answer is. I would also say that when I was playing the role of Kalinda and Jack said, we all know, what I wanted to yell out, but I wasn't supposed to do this, so I didn't do it. But I'm going to tell you now what I wanted to do, which was I wanted to say, why the hell didn't you say that in the meeting? We didn't all know it because we all just sent her off to do it. I was getting mad, actually. My role.
I'm not sure. Like, I'm really feeling very stressed.
Yeah, these scenarios, that's the good thing about acting. So I think that what Kalinda could do is to ask Jack if there's something different and how the meeting or process could be set up to avoid this kind of issue. So that if they had told BB in the beginning, we want some ideas, but one idea we're shut down to is, what was it? Turf and chips?
A steak and fries.
Steak and fries, yeah. So I think the kind thing for Kalinda and Jack to do would be to go back to the senior team and everybody participating and say, we did a disservice to BB. Because by not telling BB this from the outset, they wasted BB's time. And like cardinal sin of a leader is to waste your people's time. You're supposed to help people avoid making, and very often the kinder thing to do, I think one of the most common forms of ruinous empathy from leaders is someone's working on a project and the leaders know this project will never see the light of day, but they don't want to hurt the person's feelings. So they allow the person to keep working on. So it's like a sunk cost fallacy, but in this case, the cost is not money, it's people's time. So in an ideal world, Jack would have said something in the meeting, but I think it was better for Jack to say something after the meeting than to let BB spend another 2 weeks working on this thing.
Yeah.
Kim, you were feeling like in the role of Kalinda, some real annoyance and frustration about like, why didn't Jack say something in the meeting?
I literally got pissed off.
Yeah. So let's like kind of double click on that. When you're in that conversation, like, how would you have tried to say, like, why didn't you say it? Like, how were you managing that emotion for yourself?
Well, if I had been playing myself and not Kalinda, I would have interjected right away. What I would have said is, everybody doesn't know because we just had a meeting and nobody said anything, including you, Jack. And so, in fact, we were talking in the introduction about one of the things I'm working on right now is not using absolutist language. Like anytime you're saying everybody knows, like stop and ask yourself some questions about that, because it's rarely the case that everybody knows something.
It's at least probable that somebody does not know. Yeah.
Is this Jack or Jason?
This is Jason.
Okay.
Yeah, I have a lot of empathy for both people in this situation, because one of the ways that this perpetuates is that when you have these kinds of meetings, so like project review type of meetings or funding project meetings, it might be the case that you have like a rising star in the organization or someone who is in rock star mode in the organization whose project gets canceled and they quit, they leave.
Jason, do you mean superstar mode?
Sorry, yeah, superstar mode.
Yeah.
Thank you for correcting me. Yeah, someone in superstar mode, and they go through this process and they give the feedback directly, and the person gets pissed off and they quit and they leave. And all of a sudden, everybody's afraid now that we can't say anything for fear that someone is going to be upset at this. So, like, I know how these meetings can sort of like become a kick the can down the road as opposed to like a definitive, like, let's have a real conversation about what's going to happen. And Kim, it recalls the question, the anecdote of...
I'll tell it. I'm going to tell that anecdote.
Yeah, tell it.
One of my favorite ones. So man has a dog, loves his dog, really, as we all do on this podcast, loves his dog. The vet tells the man that he needs to cut the dog's tail off because the dog's tail has gotten infected. And because he can hardly bear to cut his beloved dog's tail off, he cuts it off an inch at a time instead of once. It's kind of gross, but it's painful. Like, obviously, it would be better to do it once. And obviously, for that person in superstar mode, the reason why a person is in superstar mode is that they really want their work to see the light of day. And so they're going to be even more pissed off in 2 weeks if they've continued to work on the thing for the next 2 weeks and you haven't told them. Exactly.
I think that it's very difficult for people to measure the cost of inaction. It's sort of like, especially when you paid a price for making a choice, being definitive, it's hard to measure the cost of inaction. But I think the cumulative effect of kicking the can down the road and then only later telling someone that their project is not going to see the light of day, it has that same feeling, which is like, why did you make me come back here over and over and over again? So I just wanted to express that, like, I don't think you need to have ill intent to wind up in this situation, but the impact is very real. Like, the cost of an action is very real. And I think the other thing that was on my mind is, coming out of this, there's at least two things that need to happen, because I do think either Kim, you said go back to the sort of committee and make sure that there's some reckoning with the fact that they did a disservice to Bibi, but I also think there's like Kalinda and or Jack or someone on that decision-making body needs to go back to Bibi and her team and say, we made a mistake. Like, we did not tell you something that we should have.
And Jason, you mentioned Kalinda as the manager, or else Jack, since Jack had the feedback. From your perspective, is it more helpful if it's coming from your manager, Kalinda, or would it be more beneficial for Bibi to hear directly from Jack?
I think there might be a two-step that needs to happen here. So one of the benefits of Kalinda giving the feedback that Kim recommended to Jack is to force the conversation, because maybe Jack is, not only is he wrong that not everybody knows, but maybe not everybody feels the same way that
Jack could be wrong. There's always that possibility.
So like, step one is like, force that conversation and make that committee come to a decision. Are we really giving this 2 more weeks in order to get into shape, or are we actually saying no, that this is not going to go forward? And then coming out of that, I think if it were me, if I were the manager, I would want to deliver that message. Because like, I'm there, I'm present in the discussion. Yeah. I'm going along with everything that's being said. If something has gone off the rails, I would want to be the one to tell the person on my team that we screwed up and we didn't tell you everything you need to know.
Yeah, and if you're the manager, it's also important not to say, Jack is such an asshole, he didn't say things earlier, which would be tempting. That happens all the time, but to really own it, to say, you know what, Bibi, I'm really sorry. I didn't realize that there was a strong point of view on the leadership team that we couldn't have any more steak restaurants. If I had known, I would have told you, but I didn't know. I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point. And when we've done a scenario like this in a lot of workshops, that's come up too. Like, are you as the manager clear on what the decision-making priorities are for this group? Like, are you setting your team member up for success?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And this is something that happens. It is another form of ruinous empathy that we haven't talked about, is not telling people soon enough. Bad news early is radical candor. Bad news late is often a form of ruinous empathy. The sooner people get the bad news, the sooner they can move on to doing work that is going to have impact, that is going to matter. And that is a kindness.
Yeah.
I think it's really interesting, Jason, how you brought in the superstar mode. And I think everyone, not even just the superstar mode, but everyone wants to feel like their work is making a difference. And Brandy, I know you feel frustrated when you feel like you're sort of doing busy work, like if there's not sort of just doing work for work's sake. Do you want to speak to that?
Sure. I, as BB, would be furious if I spent time working on something that people knew wasn't going to see the light of day. And then maybe they would say to me something like, oh, it was good practice, or I hate doing work for work's sake. I like to be working toward a goal or something that's going to be valuable to others.
Yeah. You're definitely not alone there. I loved your example of like what might be said afterward, which is a perfect illustration of the hero's journey to manipulative insincerity, where you cover up your screw up with condescension.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, nobody likes to waste time. I'm stating that as an absolute. I'm going to question it, but I really like wasting your work is work. And the reason why we do work is because we get more out of it than we put into it. And so wasted work seems really even worse than wasted food, or as bad as wasted food.
Yeah.
We have learned a lot. And Jack, excellent work.
I look forward to tips from our listening audience on how to better embody Jack.
Okay. All right. Let's move on to our friend Ted. Ted has been with Catahoula Car Rentals for 10 years. Ted oversees a large global team. He's an expert at what he does. Ted really enjoys the challenging, dynamic aspects of his job, where he's managing a fleet of off-roading vehicles. And I assume also the humans responsible for those off-roading vehicles. Ted does have a large team. He really likes to know the details of all the projects. Ted also likes to be the central point of contact for every decision. And because he's been around so long, his expertise, his long tenure, he's got a wealth of institutional knowledge. Ted's confident he knows what works best.
I already hate Ted, but let's keep going.
Oh, then there's poor Lucas. Lucas is on Ted's team and has confided in his mentor, Chelsea, that Ted's micromanagement style is inhibiting the team's growth. Lucas, several other team members, they feel like their learning potential is stunted because Ted doesn't impart knowledge to them, simply asking them to execute his plans. And then, Kim, not to sort of throw you into a tailspin, but when Lucas and other team members have proposed new ideas, Ted becomes defensive and isn't willing to consider things that he has not come up with himself. Going back to Chelsea. Chelsea is Ted's peer. Again, Chelsea is the mentor of Lucas on Ted's team. Chelsea has witnessed several of these things that Lucas has raised about Ted's management style. So Chelsea follows up, shares this feedback with a colleague of hers named Elsa, and Elsa did not give a helpful response. Kim, how do you want to play the role of Elsa? You up for that?
I would love to play the role of Elsa. In fact, I have a photo of Elsa dressed up as me.
Oh, all right. Well, again, we're going to give a guide to who's who and all these names. But in this one, Elsa's not giving radical candor. Elsa is doing something else, not helpful feedback.
Elsa, I'm just going to say, as I play the role of Elsa, I'm going to say of Elsa that Elsa does not have a growth mindset. Okay. I hear what you're saying, Chelsea, but everyone knows that's just how Ted is. He has been that way for 10 years, and no one is going to change him. Unfortunately, the team is just going to have to deal with it. Suck it up.
Wow, she even did some improv, some ad-libbing here. Just round of applause. Kim Scott playing the role of Elsa. Maybe we need that video clip. Bravo. The orange sweater never shone so brightly. Jason, what quadrant does Elsa's behavior reflect? Whatever should Chelsea do? Because look, Chelsea really thinks it's important for Ted to get this feedback.
I think the reason why this scenario is in this list is because this is something that almost everyone has run into at some point in their career. There's a senior person who who's a micromanager to some degree or another, but is quite successful, like has done a lot of really good work for the organization. And essentially, they're an asshole. But instead of the organization responding to that with radical candor, they have collectively sort of decided to respond to it with manipulative insincerity, right? They're sort of like, oh, well, that's just Ted, and we can't really do anything about it. They've abdicated any responsibility to change Ted. And so now Chelsea comes along and looks at the situation, is like, this doesn't seem great, reaches out for help, and then runs into well, that's just how Ted is. But sometimes I wonder, I had a concrete experience that really helped me understand the importance of this. Sometimes I wonder how much of this is people have sort of being afraid to challenge someone early on or clearly enough to see if they're willing to change their behavior. We were working with a big client. We were doing this big debrief call, which was after his team had gone through some training and stuff. And we asked him just to share a little bit of his reflection. And he said, I am an obnoxiously aggressive manager. I never had the words for it. I had these really tough relationships with my peers and sometimes even conflicts with my direct reports, but I never knew what was going on. And it was because of this framework that I started to understand what was happening. And by the end of the training that he went through, he said, I felt obligated to go apologize to the people I had worked with and just say, I'm sorry that I behaved this way. I realized it was really suboptimal, and it was, had I known what I was doing, I think I would have behaved differently. And so part of me is wondering, who's had a real direct conversation with Ted? You know what I'm saying? At some point they're in this insulated bubble and everybody thinks Ted will never change. But in fact, no one has actually challenged Ted directly to see if he'd be willing to change.
Yeah, I think one of the things, as I was playing the role of Elsa, I was thinking I was kind of advising manipulative insincerity, but I myself was being kind of obnoxiously aggressive.
That's interesting.
And so I was sort of trying to think which quadrant was I in? And I think I was in obnoxious aggression, but I was advising manipulative insincerity. And the thing is that I just want to, very often people don't intend to act like jerks and they're not aware. So if you can learn to not say so-and-so is an asshole, which is one of my favorite things to say. So I know it's hard not to say that. But if you can, every time you hear yourself saying so-and-so is an asshole, pause and think, what can I do to get curious, not furious in this moment? What can I do to care personally about this person and to help them not behave this way? Because very often people aren't aware of the impact that they have on others, or they are aware and they don't know what to do about it, and they themselves are very upset about this. So I think my late father was a person like this. People often thought he was a jerk. He was not a jerk. He was a great dad and a great person, and not in every way, nobody is, but obviously I love him. And I remember when I wrote Radical Candor and I was saying, just say it. He said, Kim, that is really dangerous advice for people like me, because when I just say it, people hate me. And it was clear to me when he said this that it was very upsetting to him, and it had been for many years. So try to show a little love to those people.
I find that, first of all, thank you, Kim, for sharing and honoring your dad. And I know what a lover of Radical Candor and biggest fan of yours he was. And so it's touching to hear. And I will also just say I had a recent conversation with a leader similar to what you're sharing about your dad, which is that he was a huge fan of Radical Candor and realized that his behavior was kind of similar, Jason, to your person's aha, I've been acting like a jerk. And yet was aware that he was now acting in ruinous empathy because he was almost so afraid of acting like a jerk and had gotten sort of his hand bitten enough times of saying it like it is that he didn't actually really know how to find that middle area. So I just also want to bring that in too. People might realize that this isn't the way they want to behave, but they don't really have that path forward of how to change when you've been successful. I think that helps give a little more compassion too, is it's behavior change for everyone.
Yeah, and it's hard. I mean, another example of why we need to have compassion for people who might be acting like a jerk. And having compassion doesn't mean you are not holding them accountable and you're not
Correct.
helping them change. It means you are. But there's a great book called Driven to Distraction about people with ADHD. And very often people with ADHD have been called names like asshole their whole life. And they're not. They have a condition that makes it harder for them. So again, which is not to say you have to allow yourself to be treated badly, but it's the reason to be radically candid, to tell them what they're doing, but to do it in a way that shows you care about them.
Yeah. And I think in this case, Chelsea caring both about Ted and Lucas, like as an act of love, like owes Ted some radical candor, right?
Yeah.
Like to say, like, I really care about you and I care about Lucas. And I've observed this happening. Like I've observed he's come to me with this concern, but I've also observed this. It's not just him.
Yeah.
Like I've seen this behavior from you. And I think the opportunity to say, like, help me understand why you approach things this way. Like, what is it that drives you to approach things in this way? And is there a way to mitigate some of the negative impact that this is having on Lucas? I think that sort of like curiosity first approach, like, let's have a conversation. I want to understand your perspective, I think is a really good first step to take, even if you've been advised against it, because the other side of that is, as all these stories illustrate, like the person may be hypersensitive at this point to criticism for the way that they approach these things. So approaching with curiosity might open a door to a different kind of conversation.
So maybe the fact that the person will be relieved to hear it because they know it's a problem and they feel helpless to do anything about it. And they may be glad that you're offering to help them address it.
Yeah. And coming from a place of being helpful, Jason, I was curious, you had mentioned that you would also share you've observed that. One of the questions we often get is, what if I haven't observed it or it's sort of third-hand, second-hand information? Like, how would you approach that conversation as Chelsea to Ted if you actually hadn't observed it directly?
Well, if it was possible, I would try to put myself in a situation where I could observe the behavior. So if Lucas came to me and said, look, these meetings where we're supposed to be generating ideas, all Ted does is shoot down every idea that anyone else generates, like it gets shot down. I would put myself in the situation to observe that behavior if possible. And if it wasn't possible, I think we would follow the sort of path of clean escalation from there, which is to try to figure out, is there a way for me to facilitate a conversation between Ted and Lucas that will feel safe for Lucas and hopefully uphold some of the ideas of curiosity? Because I think it's like, if you're the target of this behavior, it might be harder to actually maintain that stance of curiosity. So it might be harder for Lucas to approach with curiosity. And if Lucas wasn't comfortable doing it alone, then I would say maybe go to Lucas and Chelsea could go to Ted together and say, hey, we'd like to have a conversation with you.
I also want to warn about, there's a situation that happens with some frequency where there's someone who kind of behaves like a bully to their peers and to the people who work for them, unless the most senior person is in the room. Mm-hmm. And so there was one situation where there was one particular individual who he really behaved badly. He really bullied people. But as soon as his boss was in the room, it was all sweetness and light. And so his boss never had the opportunity to observe the behavior himself. And so it was the job of his boss, when enough people came and said, this person is bullying me, to pay attention to that and to recognize that sometimes people who engage in bullying don't do it in front of their boss.
Great point.
It was interesting because one of the things as a reflection question was like, what's driving the micromanagement behavior? And maybe this person has had to develop this behavior in order to show that they are a leader, to sort of people feeling protective of their role, especially if you have been in somewhere and maybe you feel like you're losing some power, quote unquote, or you've had to use this behavior in order to sort of speak up to power. And so I just want to call that out, that somebody who has micromanagement tendencies, in this case, there may be something else going on where they're on their way out. Maybe that there's a new generation coming in and they're losing the very thing that sort of was their identity.
Yeah, and then they're behaving in a way that makes that fear more likely to come true.
Correct.
Yes.
That which I greatly feared has come upon me. Very often when we fear something, we create the conditions for that thing we fear to happen.
Absolutely. All right. Now it's time for our Radical Candor checklist, tips you can use to start putting radical candor into practice.
Tip number 1, don't kick the can down the road. The cost of inaction, although hard to measure, is very real. Saving up feedback for fear of upsetting someone is going to cause more pain later once that person realizes that they continued down the wrong path because you failed to tell them something they need to know. There's a real benefit to giving and getting bad news early.
If you have to cut your dog's tail off, do it once, not 5 times. All right, tip number 2. The path from obnoxious aggression to manipulative insincerity is an oft-traveled road for people who are frustrated at work. Instead of getting mad, try getting curious, not furious, when you're in this place. And don't speak in absolutes, at least not most of the time. It's impossible to know whether or not someone can change their behavior if they've never been given the opportunity. And I am an optimist. I think everyone can change their behavior. I think old dogs can learn new tricks.
Tip number 3. If you've already read Radical Candor, and who hasn't, but also read it again, and you also want a refresher, you can learn the principles of Radical Candor by watching the new Radical Candor Lit, capital L, capital I, capital T, video book. This hour-long adventure features interviews with folks Kim mentions in the book, great animations, pictures of Kim from the Wayback Machine, tips for practicing Radical Candor. That's at radicalcandor.com/videobook, VIDEOBOOK. You can stream it now. For more tips, go ahead to radicalcandor.com/resources. We've got a whole bunch of really helpful learning guides. If you have questions about Radical Candor scenarios, or if you have some specific and sincere praise for our actors, Kim Scott playing the role of Elsa, and Jason Rosoff with a stunning rendition of Jack, please send them advice@radicalcandor.com. The show notes are at radicalcandor.com/podcast. I have a couple more addendums before I get to Kim giving us the name of her new book, which I think you all know, but we have Googled. This is so interesting. And by we, you mean Brandy has Googled the Einstein quote. I am fascinated. It's from Rita Mae Brown's 1983 book, Sudden Death. Brown attributes the quote to a character called Jane Fulton, and how it started being attributed to Einstein is a mystery to us. That is fantastic on-the-spot work. I have another piece of specific and sincere praise for Brandy with these names. Brandy.
Oh, happy to share. So if you will have noticed, the names are all names of pets, of people on the team, except for Kalinda, who is Archie Punjabi's character from The Good Wife, Kalinda Sharma, the investigator, who is one of my favorites. And Turf and Chips, those are the names of the dog parks at where Amy lives.
Oh my
There's one called
gosh.
Turf and one called Chips.
Well, those are shorthand names. So whenever my dog, who is a Catahoula leopard mix with a bulldog, you heard the Catahoula car rentals, they like to meet up. We call one of them Turf and one of them Chips. And Brandy realized that Turf and Chips would make a great restaurant. But I did not make Brandy work months on a presentation that was not going to go forward.
Yes.
No, and I just made up the other stuff about the cruise ships and whatnot.
And
Back to
Elsa
you,
is
Amy.
my dog. Maybe I'll send you a picture of Elsa dressed up in her very own orange sweater and Levi's.
Oh my gosh, please. We need
That was my
for the show
Halloween
notes.
costume. I didn't feel like dressing up, so I dressed my dogs as me.
That is amazing.
All right. Well, Kim, you're on a roll now. Tell us about your book, Just Work.
So the title, Just Work, just didn't work. Alas, it was too clever by half. A lot of people would read the whole book and they would not realize it was about justice. They thought I was telling them to just get shit done and stop complaining, or I don't know what. but that was not my intent. So we're thinking of a new title. We haven't totally committed to it because I like to change everything every 5 minutes. Amy is looking distressed.
This is my thinking face.
See, I should say, Amy, are you feeling distressed?
I feel zero distress. Yeah.
So anyway, the current thinking is that we will call it Radical Respect. So if you like it, let us know. If you hate that, let us know. And I'll take it under advisement.
Interesting. Where should people let you know to provide you with Radical Candor on Radical Respect?
How about Radical Candor at radicalcandor.com?
Oh, that's a good one.
Kim's proposed new title, Radical Respect. Finally.
And by the way, the title is not for Radical Candor. That is an alternative, to be clear, to just work.
Radical Candor remains Radical Candor with a splash of compassionate candor if you struggle with obnoxious aggression. Finally, Radical Candor swag. It is, the holiday time is a-coming, so radicalcandor.com, click the shop link. Brandy, is there going to be anything new beyond coffee mug, sweatshirt, stickers, and more as the season arrives?
Yes, and there are more things on there.
You can also buy your whole team the wild and woolly adventures of the feedback loop.
Oh, good point, Kim.
It's a good holiday gift, yeah.
It is a great holiday. Laughing and learning.
Laughing and learning. Ha ha, aha. Insight through humor.
Well, that's it. Bye for now.
Bye, everybody.
Everybody. Bye-bye.
Goodbye.
Bye, Jason. Bye, Brian.
Thanks for joining us. Our podcast features Radical Candor co-founders Kim Scott and Jason Rosoff, is produced by our Director of Content, Brandy Neal, and hosted by me, Amy Sandler. Music is by Cliff Goldmacher. Go ahead and follow us on Twitter at Candor and find us online at radicalcandor.com.